Welcome, comrades, to the panel Marxists Speak Out, Victory Day against Nazism and Imperialism, Yesterday and Today. May 9th marks the 77th anniversary of the surrender of the fascist Nazi forces in Europe. It was a historic day that, despite the history written by Western imperialism, was largely achieved by the forces of the Soviet worker state at the cost of 27 million lives. The day has clearly taken on extra significance this year, as once again the forces of imperialism are using fascism as a spearhead to attempt to dominate Eurasia through their escalating proxy war on Russia. It is on these links today the panelists will be focusing. This important panel will have participants from Australia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, North, Central and South America, and Europe. It is part of efforts to build a truly anti-imperialist network that fights against NATO's proxy war against Russia as part of the broader struggle against imperialism and for socialism. Classconscious.org and Liga Comunista initiated a panel on March 26, Marxists Speak Out on the conflict between Russia and NATO, and many more groups and individuals, included all the speakers today, endorsed a May Day declaration against NATO's war against Russia. This task has been made all the more vital given the accommodation of so many Marxist groups to the propaganda flooding out of the imperialist centres. Many groups have either openly endorsed the imperialist war drive or implicitly do so, hiding behind revolutionary defeatism. It will be clear, I'm sure, today from the presentations that there is much common unity and ground between the groups and individuals presenting. This unity and collaboration must continue to be built upon after today's panel. All right, so for our first, I'll just read quickly the groups and individuals who are speaking today, and then I'll introduce our first speaker. The speakers today will be from the Socialist Unity Party, the US, Mohammed Basrul Haq Sana from Bangladesh, the group Bolshevik group from South Korea, the KED from Greece, Liga Comunista from Brazil, from the LCFI, Partido Obrero Socialista from Costa Rica, Consistent Democrats from the LCFI, Great Britain, Franca Trotskista from Brazil, Fernando, I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong, Fernando, Jimenez from East Timor, Tendency Militant Bolshevik from LCFI from Argentina, Mike Gimbel from the USA, Franca Trotskista from Brazil, the Partido Comunista dos Trabalhadores Brasileiros from Brazil, and the Partido Comunista do Povo Brasileiro from Brazil. I apologize if my pronunciation was wrong. All right, so for our first speaker, I'd like to introduce Greg Butterfield from the Socialist Unity Party, USA.
Thank you, Comrade Davey. And thank you everyone for being here today. I've just come from a march of many thousands here in New York this afternoon to defend the right to abortion. As you probably know, a draft ruling by the US Supreme Court was leaked earlier this month, which would reverse the right to abortion granted under the Roe v. Wade decision almost 50 years ago. If that decision goes through, the legal precedent will also endanger many other hard-won civil rights of the US working class, including the right to same-sex marriage, protection from so-called sodomy laws used to criminalize queer people, and even interracial marriage. It truly is an attack on the whole working class. This vicious ruling class attack on reproductive rights made me think about the essential role of women and other oppressed gender people in our movements and in the Soviet victory over fascism in World War II. We know the names of some heroines like the Red Army sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko or the air fighter Lydia Litviak. But Soviet women also held down the home front, kept the factories running, and waged guerrilla warfare when their cities and towns were occupied by the Nazis. In 2016, I had the great fortune to attend the Victory Day March in Lugansk, capital of the Lugansk People's Republic. I have to say that it was one of my... It was
Sorry, comrades. Could everyone please mute their mics? Speaking. We have someone who is not muted. I'll just figure out it.
Levi, desliga teu microfone, por favor. Excuse me, Greg.
Yes.
So, Greg, do you want to continue?
Yes. Okay.
Sorry.
I was saying that in 2016, I was fortunate enough to attend the Victory Day March in Lugansk, capital of the LPR. And it was one of the most moving experiences I've had in my life as a revolutionary, to see people from the city pouring into the streets to honor not only their ancestors who fought fascism decades before, but also those who fought and died to stop Ukraine's attack on the city just a couple of years before, in 2014 and 2015. And women were also at the center of that mobilization. They were the organizers, just as they are in so many of our organizations, movements, unions, and communities. In that spirit, we are seeking ways here in the US to connect the struggle against the US-NATO proxy war in Ukraine with the emerging mass movement to fight for abortion rights and other struggles of the working class here at home. There is, I think, just in the last few weeks, there has been a change, political change that could be of enormous benefit to us, which is the growing anger and distrust of the Democratic Party, which, while posing as a friend of workers and oppressed communities in order to get elected, also is the premier war party these days, and fundamentally serves the interests of the capitalists just as much as the Republican Party. In recent weeks, we saw the spectacle of Democrats in Congress voting unanimously for an additional $40 billion for the proxy war against Russia, while at the same time failing in their rushed vote to codify abortion rights into law, despite having control of both the House and Senate. And at the same time, every single member of the Senate, both Democrat and Republican, voted to add extra security details for the Supreme Court justices who are poised to strip away a basic human right from more than half the population. The imperialist regime in the US wants to mandate forced pregnancy and birth at a time when the cost of food and rent is skyrocketing. There's a frightening shortage of infant formula, and all of the public health measures introduced for the pandemic, as weak as they were, have been repealed. And the money that could be used to mitigate some of these life and death crises is being spent on weapons and aid to prolong a war on the other side of the world. Capitalists and their insatiable drive for profits just can't stop themselves from pushing too far. They are making the contradictions of their system so glaring that it gives us, their enemies, an opportunity to educate and organize the many, many workers who are affected, especially the most downtrodden, Black and brown people, women, trans people, immigrants. As we mark the 77th Victory Day, our great task is to help our class make the connections between the struggle against imperialist war abroad and the war on workers at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg, for that presentation. And yeah, thanks to the Socialist Unity Party for all the solidarity work that you're doing. Okay, our next speaker is Mohammed Bazrul Haksina from Bangladesh. Oh, no, sorry, I think, yes, yeah, that's the order, yes. So, Mohammed, would you like to speak? Not sure, perhaps that order might have had to change, I think, actually. So that means our next speaker would be the Bolshevik group from South Korea.
Hello, comrades. So, first of all, we think following quote from Lenin's imperialism. Sorry, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I'll continue. We think following quote from Lenin's imperialism is a very useful hint in understanding today's theme, victory against Nazism and imperialism today and yesterday. So quote from Lenin, of course, finance capital finds most convenient and derives the greatest profit from a form of subjection which involves the loss of the political independence of the subjected countries and peoples. In this respect, the semi-colonial countries provide a typical example of the middle stage. It is natural that the struggle for these semi-dependent countries should have become particularly bitter in the epoch of finance capital, when the rest of the world has already been divided up. So imperialism has used a variety of methods, such as bribery, coup, military dictatorship, assassination, civil war, and direct invasion in order to achieve complete subjection, which even deprives political independence. Through this method, imperialists establish an alliance with competitor partners, which helps setting the most advantageous imperialistic super exploitation system, which extracts the greatest profit. The imperialist media have labeled certain maneuvers which took place mainly in Eastern Europe after the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991 as color revolution. The Euromaidan coup, which ousted pro-Russian regime in 2014, is one of the typical examples. The Kiev regime, established by a coup in 2014, is a fascist Nazi regime. However, the expression of fascism, Nazism, represents a portion of its essence, but does not reveal the whole causal relationship of the phenomenon. There are two reasons. First, it is not distinguished from Nazism in imperialist camp like Germany. The fascist movement, which aimed to save the capitalist system from the socialist revolution. And second, its relationship with imperialism is not fully represented. So some, including a number of leftists, say Putin government is fascist regime that oppresses the working class to the extreme. Therefore, the working class should oppose fascists in Kiev and Moscow. Since 2014, Ukrainian Kiev government has undergone several changes in personnel, but it is a pro-imperialist comprador far-right forces which are indigenous social group whose interests coincide with imperialist colonial rule. It has almost the same character as Stefan Bandera's fascist force that cooperated with German imperialists during the anti-Soviet war. Such policy of expanding imperialist colonies by using local far-right comprador forces is not limited to Eastern Europe. It's a phenomenon that happens in every colonies around the world. The cases that have occurred or on the process in past 10 years and may take place in the near future are roughly as follows. Libyan and Syrian war in 2011, Egyptian coup in 2013, Turkish and Brazilian coup in 2016, attempt of color revolution in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Hong Kong in 2019. Attempt of color revolution in Belarus in 2021, imperialist incited revolt in Kazakhstan in 2022, threat of war and attempts of color revolution ongoing in Iran. On the other hand, super profit exploited from colonies aristocratize the working class in the imperialist regions. For them, the victory of their own imperialist government in overseas and the expansion of their colonial rule improve their living standards. So they share some part of interest with their own imperialist government. While the working class in the colonial region live a miserable life, the working class in the imperialist region can enjoy a better standard of living through super profit. Since English is treated as world's common language, there is no need to spend time and effort learning foreign languages. They are also treated as the first-class citizen during their overseas trip. They are free from fear of racism, which Muslims, Blacks, and Asians are facing in Europe and North America. These factors function as pressure to push working class in imperialist regions fall into chauvinism. That is, to support its own imperialist government. This pressure is most acute in Britain and in the United States, which have continuously gained victory since capitalism entered the stage of imperialism and competition between imperialists arise. The political forces which did not fiercely resist and sever ties with this pressure became a hostage of chauvinism. Thus, they ostensibly advocate Marxism and Trotskyism, but actually support its own imperialism directly or indirectly. This phenomenon, social patriotism, did not only show up during World War I, but also during World War II, and since then, it is still ongoing. Just by looking at Ukrainian war, we can see how many Marxist, Trotskyist organizations are surrendering to imperialist pressure. If the spectrum can be listed from right to left, it would be as follows. RCIT at the far right, SWP, Cliffites, and IBT at the center, and BT, Bolshevik tendency, at the left, which declared neutrality in the 2014 Ukrainian coup. This Anglo-Saxon chauvinism was depicted in several documents written by ICLs, the struggle against the chauvinist hydra, IBTs in defense of Seymour's Marxism, and several English documents of our group. As Trotsky said, the historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of revolutionary leadership. And the crisis of leadership is due to the betrayal of opportunists who have betrayed the historical cause of the working class. We think that the most important platform issues in the construction of the world working class leadership are two of these things. First, opportunism regarding the question of imperialism and colony. Second, the attitude toward deformed worker state, especially on China. These two issues are sharply penetrating today's theme, victory against Nazism and imperialism today and yesterday. We are certain that regarding the question of Ukraine, the organizations attending this meeting are the most courageous and revolutionary part of the world proletariat movement. In that sense, we are Zimmerwald or Zimmerwald left wing. However, I'm not sure about the attitude toward China. The second issue that was raised in the 2019, during the 2019 Hong Kong crisis, and will continue to be raised as the most important issue. I wonder what kind of position the comrades here took on the Hong Kong crisis, which heated up 2019 all year long. The future of mankind depends on us. To solve the crisis, we must build a revolutionary leadership of the world working class. Today's meeting will be an important opportunity for the reconstruction of the world's revolutionary leadership, like the Zimmerwald Conference. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much to the comrades from the Bolshevik group in South Korea. Okay, so according to my list, next I've got the KED from Greece.
Okay, yeah. You hear me fine, comrades? Yep, okay. So, good morning, good afternoon, good night, comrades from the world. Thanks a lot for inviting us again to talk to this lovely gathering. My short intervention will try to focus on some aspects of the of the significance of the 9th May, and mainly the systemic attempt to distort its meaning. So, if we start from a general understanding of the Second World War, I believe that we could say that the victory against Nazism was mostly based on the struggles and of the Soviet peoples, of the Soviet Union. And we have qualitative and quantitative data to support this notion. We can see that the most losses were from the Soviet Union. We can see that the biggest part of the German military machine was destroyed by the Soviets. But we also know that the United States and the elites, the other bourgeoisie elites, started to fight quite late, actually. And this was because their goal was that the Nazis would first destroy the Soviets and then to open up a second fight in Europe for the spoils of war. So based on our historical understanding of what happened in the Second World War, we can say that if it wasn't for the Soviet struggle, we wouldn't have the defeat of Nazism. But while this is, according to our perspective, a historical truth, on the other hand, we see that as years and decades pass by, that Europeans think that the destruction of the Nazis was an American victory. And for example, there are some polls about the opinion regarding World War II in France and Europe that can support what I'm saying. And it's quite astonishing to understand that they are managing to distort in such a deep angle the historical truth, right? Of course, there is a deep interconnection between Hollywood, the main broadcasting networks like BBC, CNN, who are consciously and continuously trying to propagandize and change historical reality. And it's important to understand the significance of the information warfare in current politics. So what we saw in what we are seeing now in Ukraine, with all of these false flag operations like in Bucha or on Snake Island, that the United States and their proxies are trying to construct a narrative that the Russians are barbarians and etc. They are doing the same thing with history. So history's body also becomes a ground for staging false flag operations and falsifications. There are many consequences for this procedure. Let's define it. Let's define this phenomenon. Let's call it the snatching of history. This has immense consequences because this is not just a random discussion about the past. This has immense significance for now. Imagine if you can rewrite history, what immense power this holds for you to construct the discourses that suit you. And why is that? It's because if you can control the past, it's more easy for you to organize the present, to control the present. And we have actually seen that from the mouthpieces of imperialism. Let me give a more practical example, because until now I've been too theoretical. Let's remember about the hysteria regarding Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi. The main United States news outlets would say that Saddam Hussein is a new Hitler, right? And now we are facing the same thing. They are saying that Putin is not just a Stalin, he's a Hitler. How gruesome it is to project or even try and resemble Hitler to these kind of leaders. The goal is very specific. It is to use the Nazi atrocities, the atrocities of imperialism, as a way to create a monster out of these countries. So imperialist crimes of the past are used as a basis for justifying the current plan of imperialism. So the old crimes are used in order to justify new imperialist crimes. So, for example, isn't Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo a World War II kind of a crime? That nobody knows what's happening in there, how many people are jailed, how many people are murdered, etc. We have also seen other examples of this kind of snatching and hacking. For example, in Israel, in the way that the Holocaust is used as a way to justify the genocide of Palestinians. But I know that this is another theme that I wouldn't like to say more. So what I'm saying is that by taking history, they are more able of justifying their crimes now. They are more able of politically controlling the population and guiding them to this or that choice. And the issue is that we don't have only historical attempt to rewrite history, but also a political change, in the sense that, for example, for if you ask a liberal what is fascism or Nazism, he would probably say, he or she would probably say that it's just violence and dictatorships. And by saying that, they are actually justifying their own characters. It's the other limit in relations to themselves, right? It is the other pole of democratically elected government. So it's a kind of a dualism, where in one pole we have the pole that respects minorities, it's pro-dialogue, it's pro-rules-based policies, where on the other pole we have authoritarianism, monologue, chaos, and brutal dictators. On the other hand, we have respect for human rights, and non-violence, where on the other hand, we have no respect for human rights. So this by using this discussion regarding Nazism and fascism, they are politically rebranding themselves as the factor of progressiveness, of enlightenment. Whereas the rest of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, etc., are the beacon of the past, let's say. And it is quite funny, the fact that even though the United States empire and its satellite countries have organized hundreds of military coups in all around the world, and have actually made it quite impossible to have a normal democratic processes in these countries because they are continuously on the struggle of surviving. At the same time, they use this defensive behavior of these states as a way to criminalize them as dictatorships, as a way to slander them and make them illegitimate in Western audiences, in order to project to them the idea that they are militarists, let's say. And of course, they never really give a damn about what these populations or their leaderships say. So what is happening is that the CIA hits them, and when they react, we have the Democratic Party shouting out, whoa, look at that militarists. So we have a political system which hits together. It's kind of an organic whole, if we could say it in Marxist terms. Whoever objects the imperialist rule is often trapped in this kind of dual attack, both from the Democratic Party and the Republicans. Now, it's very important not to just try and adopt the true historical narrative about what happened on the 9th May and who destroyed the Nazi monsters, but it is very also important to make a political analysis, in the sense that Marxists do not understand Nazism as just the expression of plain violence, right? Because if we define Nazism as explicit violence, then this blurs the boundaries between what is a defensive action and an offensive action. Like, for example, what we are seeing now in Ukraine, which, in our opinion, it's a defensive action from the part of Russia. Nazism also, we cannot identify it with the feeling that one is part of a nation, right? Of course, every national feeling has a lot of metaphysical notions of great ancestry or lineage, and I don't know what else. For example, the chauvinists in Greece believe that they are descendants of ancient Greece, and etc., which, in our opinion, is laughable, at least. Also, Nazism cannot be identified with territorial disputes between different nations or nationalisms. In our opinion, we somehow we believe that this is somehow kind of the truth. Our main hypothesis, let's say, is that Nazism is probably born when is born when nationalism is mixed with imperialist dreams, let's say? Or is it when imperialism gives you the weapons to fight for them? For example, in our opinion, it's not by chance the fact that swastikas appeared in NATO army regiments in Afghanistan, and now Azov. It is also not a chance that ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Azov were given money and weapons in order to fight for the empire's war. This is an expression of the essence of what Nazism is, of the imperialist aspects of Nazism. So if we don't have a definition of what imperialism is, we will probably will not be very successful in understanding what fascism is or Nazism is. So it's very important to define what imperialism is. And right now, if I could condense in a few sentences of what imperialism is the ability to subordinate the globe, to carve the earth, as Lenin said. It's the ability to sustain and hold the global financial system, to express a global exhibit of military force and political influence. It's the ability to organize coups everywhere in the world. Also, at the same time, imperialism is having as a conscious idea to underdevelop the rest of the world, to sustain an environment of selling expensive industrial tools to deindustrialized countries. It is the strategy of not providing cultural and knowledge and equipment as a way to break their dependence. So in order to return to the 9th of May, and because I need to close my part, if we could guess what is the most probable successor of Nazism, because I don't believe that we had a true revival of Nazism in our days, the most probably candidate is the US empire and its proxies. The Nazism would probably not be revived in the rest of the world. We would guess that if it's going to be revived, it will probably be at the birthplace, which also has an imperialist function right now. It would be in Europe, the United States, and the other proxy nations that are part of this organization. So if we really want to adhere to the current meaning of 9th of May, the Victory Day, it is the destruction of this mechanism. It is the holding NATO and the White House and the rest of the imperialist organizations into account. It is to destroy them as the only way in order to remember the true significance of the Victory Day. Thank you very much, comrades. This is it for me.
Thank you very much, so comrade from the KED. All right, I am presenting next from classconscious.org, which is a website with a small editorial team in Australia and the US. Okay. According to the bourgeois press, and echoed shamefully by many so-called Marxists, to point to the connections between the current war in Ukraine, the Great Patriotic War, and the fight against fascism, is to play into the hands of so-called Putin's propaganda. However, these connections are real. That the Russians are fighting against the forces of fascism is undeniable in Ukraine. The Banderite fascists in Ukraine are not even neo-Nazis in any real sense of the term, but unreconstructed Nazis who trace their lineage directly to the fascist Ukrainian forces of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in World War II. The OUN committed massive atrocities against Ukrainians of Jewish and Polish descent as they fought alongside the Nazis and against the Soviet Red Army. The OUN then went on to be funded by the CIA to continue its war against the Soviet Union, even after the end of World War II and into the 1950s. It was therefore hardly a break with form when US imperialism under the Obama administration openly solidarized itself with and used the fascist shock troops on the ground to prosecute the Maidan coup in 2014. These Nazis employed the most vicious tactics to ensure a new Banderite regime was installed. They shot anti-government protesters in a false flag operation in Kiev to finally bring down the Yanukovych government, and herded and burnt alive 48 leftists in Odessa. It's no coincidence these crimes echo the crimes of the OUN during World War II on a smaller scale. It is a type of crimes that would have been implemented on a massive scale if the Ukrainian forces, led by the Azov Battalion, had successfully retaken the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk and wreaked their revenge on the populations there. While the fascist far-right parties do not rule directly in the current government of Ukraine under Zelensky, it is doing the bidding of both imperialism and the fascists within Ukraine. Before the Russian intervention, the suppression of left-wing parties continued. The Minsk agreement was rejected. Preparations for retaking both Crimea and the Donbass continued militarily as plans for NATO membership were advanced. Stephen Bandera was elevated to a national hero and decommunization continued. Zelensky's initial flirting with making peace in the East was quickly brought under control by the Ukrainian fascists and their imperialist paymasters. That the Russians are fighting imperialism in Ukraine is also undeniable. Weapons are pouring in, not just from the US, but other leading imperialist nations such as Germany, Britain, and secondary imperialist powers such as Canada and Australia. It is clear that the war in Ukraine is being used to accelerate and advance the latest imperialist effort to dominate the Eurasian landmass. The first such grand imperial coalition to try to do so was the 14-country Allied invasion who attacked Soviet Russia from 1917 to aid the White Armies. 10 of those countries are now part of the new imperialist alliance, sending weapons to Ukraine. The US, UK, Canada, Australia, France, Japan, Greece, Estonia, Romania, and Italy, which demonstrates the continuity of the project. The second imperialist effort was, of course, the massive Nazi fascist Operation Barbarossa, which was defeated at such an enormous cost to the Soviet people. Officially, 25 million Soviet citizens died, 18 million non-combatants, 1 out of every 10 Russians. Hitler planned to kill 30 million to create the Lebensraum, living space deemed necessary for Germany to become an imperialist country that could compete with the hegemonic US. The genocide of European Jewry and Operation Barbarossa were part of one interconnected process of extirpating Judeo-Bolshevism and destroying the urban intelligentsia of Eastern Europe. The gas vans of the SS Einsatzgruppen first rolled in Ukraine, where 30,000 Jews were thrown into the ravine of Baba Yar near Kiev, assisted by the OUN, who later some of themselves were thrown in later once the Nazis turned on them. Despite the victory of the Red Army over fascism that we celebrate on May 9th, of course, the imperialist powers never gave up on their plans to both gain control of the now Russian and Soviet landmass before that, and to smash communism once and for all. It only took until 1949 for the US to once again start working with Britain, France, and Germany to form NATO as an offensive military pact to bring down the Soviet Union. It even put leading Nazi military figures into senior positions due to their ideological and practical experience in fighting communism. After the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO has once again been massively expanded onto the borders of Russia itself, and the moves to incorporate Ukraine largely precipitated Russia's decision to military intervene in February. This brings me to some key difference between the Great Patriotic War and today's situation. Firstly, it needs to be acknowledged that Russia faces a very different kind of military threat and was even posed by the mass power of millions of Nazi soldiers and tanks that bore down upon it in 1941. Of course, even the placing of conventional weapons is threatening to the Russian state. But the fact is the new Operation Barbarossa if launched, would not be conventional, but a preemptive nuclear strike. That is why Russia cannot afford to allow the imperialists to turn its borders into a long string of missile defense systems and offensive nuclear weapons systems that render its nuclear capacity unthreatening. If such a war was launched, it is no exaggeration to suggest that Russia and its working class would be effectively wiped from the map. Of course, the resources under the ground would still be able to be mined and extracted at a later date. The same denial of how modern warfare works is the insistence by some Marxist groups that the US and Western imperialism is not directly involved in this war because they do not have, quote, boots on the ground. They turn what is a tactical move by the imperialists into an excuse for not taking a side. What I mean is that it obviously suits the US to have Ukrainian soldiers doing the dying rather than the US soldiers, whilst the US and its allies direct the war through providing nearly all the weapons and intelligence to keep the Ukrainian army functioning. This includes highly sophisticated weapons such as suicide drones and new generation anti-tank weapons. It is beyond obvious that the Ukrainian army could not function without this direct support. The tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons make the question of boots on the ground redundant. If some Marxists are confused, the imperialists are not. Biden has stated, Putin must go. Secretary of State Blinken bellowed, we want to see Russia weaken to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. And British Foreign Secretary declared that a full defeat of Russia in Ukraine, including its expulsion from Crimea, is a, quote, strategic imperative. It is in this context that the position of revolutionary defeatism is an act of cowardice at best. It ignores the impact of a NATO victory, not only on the balance of class forces within Ukraine, but internationally, as such a victory, if it does not spark World War III in the process, would only accelerate the drive to war against China as well by imperialism. Such Marxists are making no attempt to even explain why most of the global South, including even supposed allies of the US, such as India, has not joined in with the sanctions regime against Russia. Therefore, they have accommodated, not to international public opinion even, but only to the propaganda offensive of the ruling class within the imperialist centers. Russia is not itself an imperial power, whatever the subjective ambitions of Putin. It is a backward, dependent capitalist state, despite the outsized military power it inherited from the Soviet workers' state. The war in Ukraine that Russia is fighting is therefore a war against fascism and imperialism, and revolutionary defeatism should be rejected. Marxists should support the military victory of Russia over NATO and its vassal government in Kiev. However, May the 9th is also an opportunity to draw out why support for the regime of Putin should only be of a critical nature. Putin, when drawing upon the legacy of the historic victory of the Red Army over Nazism, seeks to rob it of its class context. He seeks to turn it into a victory of the Russian motherland, as opposed to the victory of the Soviet proletariat defending the gains of the 1917 revolution. Putin himself, of course, rejects Bolshevism, even going as far as blaming the current crisis on Lenin's policies on the national question. The tension has come out in the contradictory manner in which the hammer and sickle flag of the Soviet Union has manifested itself during the fighting. Russian soldiers have been seen taking down the Ukrainian flag from public buildings and replacing it not with the Russian flag, but with the Soviet flag. They have flown it from their tanks. Most famously, Anna the babushka came out waving it at soldiers she thought were Russians, there to liberate her town, only to find Ukrainian soldiers who, in the face of her protest, stomped on the flag. Of course, as Marxists, we must take every opportunity to put the Great Patriotic War in its correct class context and reject the efforts of the new Russian bourgeoisie to claim it for their own. We believe the interests of the international working class are again at stake, just as they were in World War II during the fight against Nazism. We support the forces of the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk and Russia in their struggle against imperialism and fascism. The launch of the military action by Russia on February 24th this year has acted as a dividing line to sort out which Marxist forces are truly lining up against the imperialist war drive to World War III. This panel is part of the efforts to build those links between those forces. Let's go forward together to build an international anti-imperialist movement based on Marxist principles. Thank you, comrades. Okay, so for our next speaker, I'll hand over the introduction to Humberto from Liga Comunista.
Certo, então agora para o próximo, desculpe, só ele vai passar a fala para você, Humberto, né, para a próxima, para começar a apresentação da Liga Comunista, né, a introdução da Liga Comunista.
Certo. Os próximos a falar serão o camarada Levi Pedro, pela Liga Comunista, depois o camarada Pablo Hernandes, pelo Partido Obreiro Socialista da Costa Rica, depois o camarada Ian, pela Grã-Bretanha, e depois a camarada Laura Torquato, pela fração trotskista do Brasil. Agora o camarada Levi Pedro vai falar em português, pela Liga Comunista, e depois o camarada Vinícius vai traduzir para o inglês. Levi. Pode começar, Levi. Você está sem som, está sem microfone. Liga o teu microfone.
Tá ouvindo agora? Saudações a todos os camaradas, né, nessa importante reunião, né? O meu nome é Levi Pedro, sou trabalhador operário da construção civil e participei do Partido dos Trabalhadores no período de sua fundação. Hoje sou militante da Liga Comunista e faço daqui a nossa sessão aqui do Comitê de Ligação pela Quarta Internacional. Pela primeira vez desde a Segunda Guerra Mundial, o nazismo conquistou o poder em um país. Foi em 2014, na Ucrânia, o segundo maior país do continente europeu, que possui uma população de 45 milhões de pessoas. Apoiado pelos Estados Unidos e União Europeia, grupos nazistas derrubaram, através de um golpe de Estado, um governo democraticamente eleito. Desde então, os nazistas ucranianos mataram 14 mil pessoas para submeter o país à União Europeia e à OTAN. Legalizaram o nazismo, proibiram o comunismo, os partidos de oposição e assassinaram os sindicalistas. O nazismo é o porrete do capital financeiro e da OTAN contra os trabalhadores para aumentar a exploração e quebrar sua resistência. Trabalhando mais e sendo impedido de protestar e fazer greve. Não podemos deixar que hoje o nazismo imperialista tenha seu dia da vitória. Isso vai ser terrível para os trabalhadores explorados de todo o mundo. Por isso, fazemos uma frente com a Rússia contra o imperialismo e sua marionete ucraniana. Não nos contentamos com a independência de parte da Ucrânia. A burguesia russa, assim como a burguesia ucraniana ou brasileira, não merece nossa menor confiança, pois sempre capitulam na luta contra o imperialismo. Mas o inimigo principal é o imperialismo opressor do planeta, explorador de todos nós. A solução é a unidade dos trabalhadores e da juventude para construir comitês de autodefesa e um partido mundial da revolução socialista, para esmagar o imperialismo e o nazismo. Por isso, hoje, fazemos frente única com Putin, o diabo e sua avó, contra o nazismo imperialista, como nos ensinou o camarada Trotsky contra Hitler. Em 1932, o camarada Trotsky nos explicava a diferença entre um governo fascista e um Estado fascista. O fato de um governo anunciar medidas de expropriação radical dos trabalhadores ou manifestar desejo de reprimir a população ainda não o tornam fascista. Trotsky dizia que o Estado se tornava fascista quando proibiu os elementos da democracia operária que existe e são conquista dos trabalhadores dentro do regime capitalista. Quando o Estado intervir no sindicato, proibir partidos de esquerda, prender e torturar representantes políticos da classe trabalhadora, o Estado se tornou fascista. Ainda não aconteceu isso de forma sistemática nos Estados Unidos, Brasil, Hungria, Rússia ou França, mas aconteceu na Ucrânia a partir do golpe de Estado russofobo e anticomunista em 2014, apoiado pelos Estados Unidos e a União Europeia. Se na Segunda Guerra Mundial, devido às contradições e disputas militares interimperialistas, não ficou claro que o imperialismo impulsionou o nazifascismo, Agora não existe mais dúvidas. Entre a Primeira Guerra Mundial, em 1919, quando foi executada pelos germes do nazismo, apoiado pela social-democracia, Rosa Luxemburgo formulou a alternativa: socialismo ou a barbárie. Depois da ascensão de Mussolini em 1922 e de Hitler uma década depois, as coisas ficaram mais claras. É possível ao capitalismo gerar algo pior que a barbárie, o fascismo. Trotsky dizia em 1939, após a experiência italiana, repetimos 1000 vezes, ou o comunismo ou o fascismo. Agora a questão se apresenta de forma mais cristalina que nunca. O neonazismo é um agente da OTAN e o neonazismo é um agente do imperialismo decadente. Contra o neonazismo e a OTAN, nós nos juntamos com o diabo e sua avó, com Putin, Xi Jinping, Assad, Kim Jong-un e Maduro. Nós preferimos uma Ucrânia ocupada por um país oprimido como a Rússia do que pelos nazi-imperialistas da OTAN, dos Estados Unidos, da Alemanha, da Inglaterra e da França. Mas nós precisamos de uma nova organização internacional comunista dos trabalhadores para derrotar o nazismo e o imperialismo definitivamente. Chegará o dia que será o dia da vitória definitiva sobre o nazismo, quando definitivamente a humanidade enterrar o imperialismo e o capitalismo. Isso era o que a Liga Comunista tem a dizer hoje aos camaradas. Obrigado pela atenção de todos os camaradas.
Vinícius, pergunta para o David Heller e os demais camaradas se é necessário que você apresente o texto em inglês ou se podemos passar ao próximo apresentador, expositor.
Okay. So is it necessary for me to translate the text now or for everyone, or should we pass to the next person that will speak?
I think the idea is we'll publish the speeches in English on our website later. That was my understanding, rather than translate. But that said, I'm happy to read out the speech in English if someone would prefer, or someone can read it out in English if people want to hear it in English.
Okay, so I can translate if you want, but
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Okay.
Go for it.
Okay, so just a moment. Okay. My name is Levi Pedro. I'm a civil construction worker. I've participated of the Workers' Party during its foundation period. Today, I am a militant of the Liga Comunista, Brazilian sector of the Liaisons Committee of the Fourth International. For the first time since the Second World War, Nazism has conquered power in the country. It was in 2014 in Ukraine, the second largest country of the European continent, which has a population of 45 million people. Supported by the United States and the EU, Nazi groups deposed through a coup d'etat a democratically elected government. Since then, the Ukrainian Nazis killed 14,000 people to submit the country to EU and NATO. They have legalized Nazism, forbidden communism, opposition parties, and assassinated syndicalists. Nazism is the bludgeon of financial capital and of NATO against workers to increase the exploitation and break their resistance. Working more and being forbidden from protesting and making strikes. Today, we cannot allow Nazi imperialism to have its victory day. This would be terrible for the exploited workers from all of the world. Because of this, we make a stand with Russia against imperialism and its Ukrainian puppet. We are not satisfied with the independence of a part of Ukraine. The Russian bourgeoisie, like the Ukrainian and Brazilian ones, must not have even a small percentage of our trust because they will always capitulate in the struggle against imperialism. But the main enemy is the imperialism that oppresses our planet and exploits all of us. The solution is workers' unity and the unity of the youth to build committees of self-defense and a worldwide party of socialist revolution to crush imperialism and Nazism. This is why today we make a united front with Putin, the devil, and his grandmother against Nazi imperialism, as Comrade Trotsky taught us to do against Hitler. In 1932, Comrade Trotsky explained to us the difference between a fascist government and a fascist state. The fact that a government announces measures of radical exploitation of workers or manifest desire to repress the population don't make it fascist yet. Trotsky said that the state becomes fascist when it forbids the elements of workers' democracy that existed and were conquered by conquest of the workers inside of the capitalist regime. The state became fascist when it intervened in syndicates, forbid left-wing parties, arrested and tortured political representatives of the working class, and tortured political representatives of the working class. Then the state became fascist. This still hasn't happened in a systematic form in the USA, Brazil, Hungary, Russia, or France. But it happened in Ukraine after the Russophobe and anti-communist 2014 coup d'etat supported by the USA and the European Union. In the Second World War, it didn't become clear to everyone that imperialism pushed Nazi fascism forward. It didn't become clear because there were military conflicts between the imperialism of Nazism and the imperialism of the Allies. But now it must be clear to all of the world that imperialism, USA and NATO, financed and sent weapons to Nazism, to the Azov Battalion. There are no doubts anymore. Nazism is a Frankenstein of imperialism against the workers. After the First World War in 1919, Rosa Luxemburg was executed by the vermin of Nazism supported by social democracy. Before she died, Rosa Luxemburg formulated the alternative socialism or barbarism. After the rise of Nazi fascism in Italy and Germany, things became more clear. It's possible for capitalism to generate something worse than barbarism. Worse than barbarism is fascist barbarism. Trotsky said in 1939 that after the Italian experience, we repeat 1,000 times, either communism or fascism. Now the question is presented in a more crystal clear form than ever. Neo-Nazism is an agent of NATO. Neo-Nazism is an agent of decadent imperialism. Against neo-Nazism and NATO, we have joined with Xi Jinping, Assad, Kim Jong-un, and Maduro. We prefer a Ukraine occupied by an oppressed country like Russia than by Nazi imperialism of NATO, the USA, Germany, England, and France. But we need a new international communist organization of workers to defeat Nazism and imperialism definitely. It will come the day when it will be the definitive victory against Nazism, when definitely humanity will bury imperialism and capitalism. This is what the Liga Comunista has to say for the comrades. Thank you for listening.
Obrigado, Vinícius. Agora fala o companheiro Pablo Hernández, do Partido Obrero Socialista de Costa Rica.
Buenas, saludos a todos y todas del Partido Obrero Socialista de Costa Rica. Hace unas semanas se conmemoró un 77 aniversario del triunfo del Ejército Rojo sobre el imperialismo alemán. Y nosotros aclaramos que no es solamente contra los nazis, porque el nazismo fue solamente la envoltura, el método, el programa para movilizar amplias masas en razón de los intereses de la burguesía imperialista alemana. Sin embargo, el triunfo sobre el imperialismo alemán en 1945 tuvo una doble condición en el sentido de que se estableció una paz, un régimen mundial de coexistencia pacífica que por un lado significaba el asentamiento, la afirmación de la conquista del Estado obrero que había sobrevivido a esta agresión, a esta guerra, pero también una política de permanente capitulación para mantener la distribución del poder en el mundo y la convivencia entre el proyecto socialismo en un solo país que levantaba la ex URSS y el imperialismo norteamericano y sus socios. El imperialismo norteamericano no cedió a un status quo y activó lo que se ha dado en llamar Guerra Fría, un sabotaje y permanente ofensiva para lograr el objetivo que la Alemania imperialista, burguesa, nazi, no había logrado, que era aplastar el Estado obrero de la Unión Soviética. El imperialismo no podía hacerlo inmediatamente después de la guerra porque las relaciones de fuerza no le favorecían. Sin embargo, fue trabajando a partir de esa política llamada Guerra Fría para lograr lo que logró en 1991, que fue la disolución de la URSS con la capitulación de la burocracia ex-stalinista, ex-soviética, y sin embargo, esa situación que creían la podían resolver convirtiendo al Estado o al ex-Estado obrero socialista en una potencia de segundo orden, totalmente sometida al imperialismo norteamericano y proclamar el dominio absoluto de la unipolaridad, la situación no se le presentó como esperaba, porque la exburocracia soviética para nosotros rebobinó, volvió hacia atrás el proceso caótico y en desbandada que tenía de restauración capitalista y restauración del Estado burgués, y se da una política por defender el carácter nacional y reestatizar las actividades económicas productivas más importantes y estratégicas y pasar a hacer lo que ha hecho la burocracia china, que es un proceso más controlado de vuelta al capitalismo o de restauración del capitalismo, generando o creando una nueva burguesía, solo que con un control sobre la misma para que no se desborde y no amenace el proceso de transformación de las burocracias, ex burocracias soviéticas, en el caso de China, de la burocracia del Partido Comunista Chino, a transformarse en burguesías y transformar su país, el caso de China, en un estado restaurado capitalista. Nosotros no vemos todavía que Rusia haya terminado ese proceso de restauración capitalista y de restauración del Estado burgués. Nosotros todavía vemos un proceso que está en camino, avanza enormemente, ha avanzado más con definiciones constitucionales que determinan que Rusia ya no es el Estado obrero que fue y que define una serie de garantías y derechos para la propiedad privada. Sin embargo, si se estudia la misma Constitución y se va a la realidad actual de la economía rusa, vamos a encontrar que hay una fórmula casi socialdemócrata, un proyecto socialdemócrata de construcción socialdemócrata en un solo país, digámoslo para asemejarlo al planteo inicial de la burocracia soviética, que era la de construir el socialismo en un solo país. Ahora, esta burocracia reciclada en proceso hacia la restauración total y completa del capitalismo y de restauración de la burguesía en Rusia, lleva adelante lo que llamamos nosotros un proceso de socialdemocracia, economía mixta, fuerte estatización, pero sobre un fortalecimiento del Estado-nación. Después de la disolución de la URSS, entonces, el imperialismo norteamericano no ha podido sostener ese resultado que quería de instalar la unipolaridad, porque esta ex burocracia soviética no aceptó el curso restauracionista atropellado y liquidador de su propia existencia y pasó a la contraofensiva construyendo lo que hoy es Rusia y que hemos estado abordando en mi intervención. Así también, por la crisis crónica o agotamiento del capitalismo imperialista, nuevas potencias han surgido y otras se han recuperado, postulándose también como una amenaza para esa unipolaridad. El imperialismo hace cálculos y está decidido a hacerse primero de Rusia, ya derrotándola o llevándola a una capitulación. Con esta guerra utiliza a Ucrania como fuerza militar y participan con la financiación y dotación de armamento y logística sin tener que recurrir por ahora a una guerra abierta metiendo a la OTAN. Cuida el imperialismo de no pasar a un conflicto de carácter nuclear que acabaría con el marco de control y administración de la crisis crónica capitalista que vive y que abriría un periodo incierto, distópico, apocalíptico, de barbarie triunfante postnuclear. Aunque tampoco podemos obviar esa posibilidad, puesto que es una burguesía imperialista en agonía y no puede descartarse tampoco que actúe en consonancia, pues activando el botón nuclear. Con el bloqueo económico, el aislamiento político, la neutralización de China y otras potencias, el sostenimiento de su brazo armado ucraniano y con las contradicciones dentro de la exburocracia soviética de medias tintas que sigue apostando a lograr la disuasión concertada con una negociación que asegura el freno de la expansión de la OTAN, la neutralidad de Ucrania, y poner hasta en negociación los territorios del Donbass o inclusive el de Crimea, el imperialismo norteamericano y sus socios siguen escalando, alargan el conflicto, aumentando sus presiones, ya para lograr un empate derrota o una derrota definitiva de Rusia en Ucrania con el retiro de las tropas o con el fin de la declarada operación militar. De ahí que los objetivos de Rusia de hacerse del control hasta las fronteras del Donbass sea su eje al no lograr que con sus primeras intervenciones, las primeras semanas de iniciada la operación en Ucrania, no lograra la capitulación o una negociación que le garantizara sus objetivos de neutralización, desmilitarización y no expansión de la OTAN. Si Rusia logra no solo liberar el territorio del Donbass y sostenerlo sin someterlo a negociación, esto sería un tremendo golpe al imperialismo y retrasaría una confrontación mayor y hasta una confrontación nuclear por un tiempo. La ilusión en un mundo policéntrico o multipolar que alientan las exburocracias soviéticas y la burocracia china, así como otras potencias y naciones de corte nacionalista burgués, no tienen ninguna posibilidad y es una total quimera. El imperialismo norteamericano y el imperialismo en general continúan hoy más que nunca en una delirante concentración de capital y en un necesario barrido y redefinición de competidores. La Tercera Guerra Mundial o los prolegómenos de esta ya han empezado y será el campo militar que resolverá el nuevo orden mundial. Decimos no a la guerra neonazi de la OTAN y la coalición imperialista jefiada por Estados Unidos y articulada por el ejército ucraniano contra la autodeterminación de Rusia y el Donbass. Decimos por la defensa de Rusia contra las sanciones y bloqueos, la rusofobia neonazi y por el triunfo militar de las fuerzas de liberación del Donbass. Solo el socialismo y la derrota del imperialismo a nivel mundial es la salida a la barbarie nuclear a la que lleva el imperialismo a la humanidad. Estamos del lado de Rusia y por la derrota de las fuerzas de OTAN y su ejército carne de cañón ucraniano neofascista. La defensa de Rusia en cuanto a defensa de la autodeterminación de las naciones contra la expansión y agresión orgánica imperialista es extensiva a los territorios del Donbass y Crimea. El Donbass en los últimos 8 años sufrió la escalada ofensiva contra Rusia. El imperialismo se ha hecho de Ucrania y convertido a esta en una punta de lanza para avanzar más amenazante hacia los centros importantes de Rusia, desplegando una guerra de exterminio de la población rusa y echando mano de esta tarea arrasadora y criminal de neonazismo para no mostrar o evidenciar directamente su responsabilidad en la ofensiva. Por tal razón, nuestra defensa y apoyo militar a las fuerzas rusas y a las milicias de Donetsk y Lugansk, y por el triunfo sobre las fuerzas armadas ucranianas y filonazis o nazis. Pero advertimos que ninguna independencia nacional y ningún mejoramiento de la situación económica, social, cultural y política de los trabajadores y los pueblos se puede lograr si no se refunda y reconquista el poder obrero y popular en la ex-URSS y en los estados obreros del este de Europa. Nos dirigimos también a los trabajadores y pueblos de los países europeos que están dentro de la OTAN a que participan dentro de la Unión Europea en esta guerra contra Rusia para que desarrollen un programa derrotista de sus propios gobiernos y fuerzas militares, para que siguiendo el ejemplo de sectores populares como los búlgaros y en otros países como en Grecia y demás, exijan a sus gobiernos que no envíen armas a Ucrania y retiren el apoyo a ese gobierno neofascista y a la ofensiva e iniciativa del imperialismo yanqui que ha arrastrado a la guerra a las naciones europeas contra Rusia. La paz, como decía una mujer en un video la semana pasada, cuando un filonazi en Samara le hacía notar que ella estaba con la guerra porque tenía una Z en su mochila inscrita, la mujer le respondió: yo defiendo a los militares que están peleando porque quiero la paz, porque la paz no se puede garantizar si no es sobre el triunfo en esta guerra del ejército ruso y de los ejércitos del Donbass contra Estados Unidos, su escudero ucraniano y europeo. Aunque se logre una paz temporal y relativa, porque sabemos que una paz sostenida solo el socialismo la puede garantizar. Los gobernantes europeos y norteamericanos y los que en otras latitudes respaldan esta guerra contra Rusia son los responsables de profundizar la crisis económica, el encarecimiento y desabastecimiento de bienes, así como el empobrecimiento de amplias masas por las sanciones que llevan adelante contra Rusia. Levantamiento incondicional de las sanciones y paz con Rusia. Ni armas a Ucrania ni sanciones a Rusia. Eso es paz. La guerra contra Rusia empuja al mundo a una guerra nuclear si no la detenemos y si Estados Unidos avanza o triunfa. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, compañero Pablo, que habló por el Partido Obrero Socialista de Costa Rica. Now, speak comrade Jan from Gran Bretaña.
Thank you, comrades. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. I'm speaking for the Consistent Democrats in Great Britain. The conflict between Nazi Germany and the USSR in World War II was a class war. It was a continuation of the war intervention, as Comrade Davey actually stated, of 1918 to 1921, which was waged by a 14-nation imperialist-led coalition, including Britain, France, the US, Japan, Canada, Italy, Australia, Estonia, Romania, Greece, Poland, China, Czechoslovakia and Serbia, I believe that consisted of. Its aim was simply to crush and defeat the Russian Revolution. And that's always been the strategic aim of imperialist capitalism in its interventions around the world, to stamp on the very possibility of the overthrow of capitalism and to defeat and even destroy any nation or people whose working class succeeds in expropriating the capitalists. And it's useful to note that Germany played no role in that coalition, although it had earlier intervened against the revolution in its own right in the immediate aftermath of October and forced the Bolsheviks to temporarily cede territory, mainly in Ukraine, in the Peace of Brest-Litovsk. This only lasted until Germany surrendered to the forces of the Triple Entente in World War I, after which the Bolsheviks rapidly recovered the territory that had been ceded. However, then they had to fight the other imperialists who defeated Germany. Inter-imperialist conflict has consumed European capitalism throughout the first part of the 20th century. And this is because Britain had been the world capitalist hegemon in the 19th century, and through that effectively become the imperialist world hegemon when capitalism became characterized by monopolies and the division of the whole world between capitalist great powers. But when Britain became the hegemon, it was quite a weak hegemon. It was already in relative decline when it gained that position. And it's clear that even though German imperialism was the rival imperialism that was in prolonged dispute with that world hegemon, their enmity of the British Empire and its allies was not as fundamental as it was to the working class and the Russian Revolution. And that's where Hitler came in. Hitler's main purpose for the ruling class was to destroy the labour movements at home as part of crushing the working class internationally. And that meant destroying Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution. And that's very clear from Hitler's writing and speeches. And it's also clear that this aspect of Hitler's politics had the fervent sympathy of arch-British imperialists like Churchill, who only feared that Hitler would also lay his hands on the British Empire. And that was true generally of Hitler's rivals. So the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 between Germany and Imperial Japan, which was later joined by Italy, fascist Italy, was the clear forerunner of NATO, and it had the same purpose, the destruction of the revolution, the Russian Revolution, and all that flowed from it. But the issue of world hegemony at the time of World War II had not been resolved, and it took the war itself, World War II, to finally replace Britain's weak hegemon with a massively stronger one. And that was the issue that had to be fully resolved to fully unify imperialism against the USSR. The barbaric nature of the attack on the USSR by Hitler, with the destruction of tens of millions of its people to scorched earth, exterminationist massacres, was only different in scale from the massacres so far of US imperialism. It was not different in kind. So in Vietnam and Korea, the US fought to drive back social revolutions that challenged capitalism. And their techniques of doing so are very similar to those of Hitler. They would have been able to do similar things in China, but they were too late to make a serious attempt to stop the Chinese Revolution. But the nuclear threats against China during the Korean War were of a similar type. And as it turned out, the strategy of the most radical Stalinist guerrilla factions, though they were not centered on the working class, but a strategy of prolonged people's war based on peasant insurgency, the imperialists learned the hard way that also could sometimes lead to the abolition of capitalism. They learned that in China. The imperialist response to people's war in such conflicts was to exterminate the people. And that, again, it echoed the counter-revolution, the bloody counter-revolutionary strategy of the Nazis. And in a sense, US hegemony, it subsumed both British imperialism's world hegemony and the Third Reich, and many of the clients of both. They made use of personnel from the Third Reich to rebuild West Germany as a bastion of NATO, personifying General Galen, who was the leader of West German intelligence, who rebuilt that after the war. After previously he'd done the same job for Hitler, and they made considerable use of Nazi clients and allies throughout East Europe after World War II. The whole captive nations cloud in Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states and, of course, Ukraine, including some of the deadliest killers and criminals like Bandera, who was employed by the CIA to work politically against communism in the East until he was eliminated in 1958, I believe. And even with the destruction of the Soviet Union, the crusade against communism has somehow continued. And I think this crusade against Russia is in fact a continuation of it. The resurrection of bourgeois support for Hitlerism is a crusade against Russia and all things Russian is a manifestation of the same thing. The expansion of NATO is part of the same purpose. Otherwise, what's NATO for? And I've just asked the question, how can this be? The Soviet worker state was destroyed in 1991 and a form of capitalist state was recreated. I'd just like to point out there's one word of wisdom from a Stalinist leader, which sort of derived from Marxism, was from the former Prime Minister of China, Zhou Enlai, in the early 70s, when he was asked what the historical significance of the 1789 French Revolution was. And he replied, whether this is apocryphal, I'm not sure, he replied that it's much too early to say. Right? And I thought that was quite a remarkable statement. I think you can almost say the same thing about the August coup and the 1991 counter-revolution in the USSR. It's much too early to say to what its real significance was. And that's true of the other counter-revolutions in China as well. It's much too early to say how sustainable capitalist restoration actually is. And that's what's behind this. Imperialism suspects that it's not sustainable. And they fear, they have good reason to suspect from the history of bourgeois revolutions that this could be the case. Recall what happened after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 and the restoration of the Bourbons in France. It might succeed in restoring the French monarchy and all the trappings, but it didn't succeed in restoring the feudal order. And I think that the imperialists fear the same will prove to be true in Russia and China, that capitalist restoration will ultimately prove unsustainable and that communism will revive. They even see Putin as in some way an expression of that with his retreats from neoliberalism. And I think that's really why Nazism is being revived and rehabilitated today. And I think this is where Victory Day is very, very important, is that we must acknowledge the continuity between today's war drive against Russia with Operation Barbarossa, with the intervention against the Bolshevik Revolution. And we must, in that sense, renew our solidarity with Russia against Nazism and against these war threats, just as we did in previous generations. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks, Ian. I think is our next speaker on the list that I've got. I think Humberto, you were going to introduce, was Fracao Trocisca from Brazil.
Camarada Laura Torquato, da fração trotskista do Brasil. Pode abrir seu microfone e falar, companheira. Laura? Torquato.
Maybe we've lost.
Camarada Laura Torquato, da fração trotskista.
Olá, camaradas. Boa noite. Perdão, é que eu achei que tinha aberto o microfone. Me escutam agora? Não me escutam? Estão me escutando? Escutam?
We can hear you.
Sí, estás escuchando.
Escutam, né?
Estamos
Sim,
escutando, sim, pode falar.
Então, boa noite, camaradas. Perdão pela falha, mas as coisas tecnológicas têm isso mesmo.
Pode continuar, Laura.
Há uma resistência, né, revolucionária que persiste nessa luta, né, nesse momento tão difícil. Então, nesse sentido, nós louvamos todos que estão aqui, tantos indivíduos, né, militantes, individualmente, como organizações, tá certo? Pedimos desculpa porque estamos falando em português, não temos domínio da língua inglesa, americana, por isso nossa fala vai ser em português. Bom, companheiros, sobre o Dia da Vitória, sobre essa atividade de hoje, nós achamos uma atividade de fundamental importância, tá certo? Uma atividade que, historicamente, para os trabalhadores, tem um valor muito grande, embora muitas organizações nem percebam isso. Embora também o mundo ocidental, né, tratou de querer esconder isso da história, né, o Dia da Vitória, como uma espécie de rechaço mesmo ao legado, tá certo, da Revolução Russa, em 1917. Por que nós dizemos isso? Porque no mundo ocidental, quando se fala em Segunda Guerra Mundial, o que se lembra, né, o que a imprensa lembra, a imprensa pró-capitalista lembra, é do dia D, né, como um símbolo, um marco de vitória sobre os nazistas, o que não corresponde à verdade, né? O dia D ocorreu antes do dia da vitória, tá certo? E não marcou definitivamente uma vitória sobre os nazistas, ou seja, não pôs fim à guerra. O dia da vitória é o dia que realmente pôs fim à guerra, né, e ao nazismo na Alemanha. E este dia foi possibilitado, com todas as críticas que possamos ter e que se deve ter realmente, né, à burocracia russa, na época os stalinistas, mas esse dia foi possibilitado, queiramos ou não, pelo Exército Vermelho, né? E isso é um legado da Revolução. Então, nós podemos dizer que o proletariado internacional teve uma primeira vitória através digamos assim, coordenado pelos soviéticos, principalmente com a Revolução Russa em 1917. Uma vitória internacional importantíssima, né, para mover as forças trabalhadoras, as forças proletárias contra as forças capitalistas. E na Segunda Guerra Mundial, nós tivemos o mundo soviético, né, os trabalhadores, o proletário soviético, traz essa segunda vitória para o proletariado internacional, através do Dia da Vitória, né, com a derrota aos nazistas, né, na Alemanha. Então, esse dia deve ser um dia lembrado, é um dia histórico que as organizações revolucionárias, né, e de esquerda, mas principalmente as revolucionárias, quem se dedicam mais a isso, digamos assim, né, do ponto de vista programático, lembrar, né, e saudar este dia como um dia, não para saudar A ou B, mas para saudar como um legado que a Revolução Russa nos deixou, como uma vitória. Este dia da vitória, né, que neste ano de 2022 coincide, 77 anos, né, acontece com a situação, com a guerra na Ucrânia, né? Nós temos que fazer, digamos assim, uma extensão, e não podemos fugir de falar desse Dia da Vitória, não podemos fugir de falar da guerra da Ucrânia, né? Que, como é que eu diria, que se a gente concorda ou não, tá certo, com o governo Putin, essa não é a questão. É claro que o governo Putin, né, Putin e a própria China, tá certo, Cuba, né, aqui a Nicarágua, mas é claro que esses são, queira ou não queira, digamos assim, são dissidências, evoluções, entre aspas, né, de uma burocracia que veio pós-Revolução Russa. Mas a questão não é essa. A questão não é se Putin fez um desfile para lembrar o dia D e enaltecer sua força sobre a Ucrânia, etc. Não, a questão não é essa. A questão da Ucrânia não deve ser visto como como é que eu diria? Como que se a crítica fosse colocada sobre o Putin. E por que nós estamos dizendo isso? Porque nós vemos que há uma infinidade de organizações no mundo que não compreendem esse problema, não compreendem o problema da guerra na Ucrânia. E por não compreenderem, fazem trincheira com os nazistas na Alemanha. Por que fazem trincheira com os nazistas na Alemanha? Não, perdão, na Ucrânia. Fazem trincheira quando acabam absorvendo todas as mentiras contra a Rússia. A posição da Rússia, está certo? A Rússia, digamos assim, fazer o que o governo Putin chama de operação especial na região de Donbas, na Ucrânia, é mais um elemento de resistência. Ainda não é uma vitória necessariamente, né? Foi a vitória como é que eu diria, em 2014, mas ainda não é uma vitória completa. Entretanto, é uma resistência, é uma demonstração de resistência, ou seja, novamente, o mundo se encontra, o proletariado se encontra, tá certo, às beiras do nazismo, apoiado pelos Estados Unidos e pelo imperialismo europeu, e, mais uma vez, o soviético, tá certo? É a Rússia, não importa se é sob a direção de Putin, mas é aquele povo que resiste de frente a esta tentativa desse nazismo em crescer no mundo todo. E por isso mesmo que essa guerra perde o caráter de uma guerra particular entre a Ucrânia e a Rússia e passa a ser uma guerra entre a Rússia e a OTAN. Diga-se a OTAN, Estados Unidos e seus aliados na Europa. Daí porque é tão importante que a gente, ao lembrar o dia da vitória, tá certo? O dia 9 de maio, o dia da vitória, a gente entenda que a guerra na Ucrânia, tá certo? É uma guerra de defesa por parte da Rússia e de resistência ao nazismo no século XXI. Portanto, todo o nosso apoio, nós devemos apoiar incondicionalmente e defender o povo russo e defender, sim, neste momento, tá certo, o governo russo que prepara suas tropas e enfrenta com muita garra, né, o governo ucraniano como um governo de representação, na verdade, dos Estados Unidos. Portanto, nós achamos importante essa atividade, gostaríamos de deixar essa palavra e também, por fim, saber que a vitória da Rússia sobre os nazistas ucranianos, ela também é uma vitória do proletariado. Ela é uma extensão, é uma derrota aos projetos imperialistas dos Estados Unidos, tá certo? Que não querem parar contra a Rússia, querem se estender para a China e querem se estender mais e mais para todo mundo, né? Então, esse é o projeto americano e seus aliados. Se nós temos um avanço do nazismo no mundo todo, significa dizer que o proletariado ele vai sofrer por muito mais tempo, mais derrotas. Significa dizer que nós teremos muito mais dificuldade para nos organizarmos com vistas a uma organização internacional, com vistas a reorganizar a Quarta Internacional, com vistas à Revolução Proletária. Portanto, mesmo que essa vitória não signifique, tá certo? Mesmo que as críticas à burocracia stalinista, as burocracias que vieram após a Revolução Russa, a derrota da Revolução Russa, entre aspas, mesmo assim, nós temos que entender que nós estamos no momento proletariado, o mundo passa por uma crise tão séria e nós temos, depois de muito tempo, um confronto completo entre as duas classes que Marx falava, do capitalismo. E neste confronto, nós temos que fazer uma verdadeira frente única e ampla contra o imperialismo. Não importa os nossos passos lá na frente, agora é uma frente, e essa frente ela deve ser comandada, o seu carro-chefe é pela vitória, tá certo, da Rússia contra a Ucrânia, pela derrota dos nazistas na Ucrânia. Então, nós podemos ver brevemente o avanço do nazismo através da Ucrânia nem cresceu tanto, mas nós temos visto as guerras que os Estados Unidos têm feito em diversos países, né, no mundo, no Oriente Médio, tá certo, na África, a América Latina, que ele já domina faz tempo, a Europa, que é dominada, submetida, né, com suas bases militares americanas em seus países, está certo? Nós temos que frear esse processo. Basta ver o que acontece no Brasil, né? Basta ver. E o que aconteceu na Ucrânia em 2014, semelhante ao que aconteceu no Brasil também aqui. Nós tivemos um golpe. O resultado desse golpe é o retrocesso das conquistas dos trabalhadores, é o retrocesso da consciência da vanguarda revolucionária, é o retrocesso das nossas lutas. Então, por isso que é um dever programático, marxista, é um dever nosso, tá certo, com vistas à organização internacional e com vistas a reerguer, né, a lutar pela revolução proletária, que isto está vivo, que para os revolucionários isto não está morto, tá certo? A tese marxista de que o capitalismo não tem vida eterna, somente quem não entende o marxismo acredita que a revolução não acontecerá. Não, a revolução ela acontecerá, porque o capitalismo não terá vida eterna. E para isso é preciso que a gente vá, enquanto esse período não chega, que nós não sabemos como se dará, é preciso que a gente vá em cada batalha. A situação na Ucrânia, a guerra na Ucrânia, é uma batalha que nós estamos vivendo. Como foi o dia D, com muito mais força, tá certo? Então, por isso que nós louvamos esta atividade dos companheiros, né? Louvamos também o dia da vitória, sim, como o dia quem derrotou, quem realmente pôs fim à Segunda Guerra, foram os soviéticos, e agora defendemos e apoiamos incondicionalmente, né, a vitória da Rússia contra os nazistas ucranianos. Então, é isso, companheiros, muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada, camarada Laura Torquato, que falou pela fração trotskista. Agora vai falar o companheiro Fernando Ximenes, do Timor-Leste.
Compañeros y camaradas, obrigado y greetings from East Timor. And I will just go straight to my presentation, Omar, my short intervention in here. I will address the topic of the false unity and eroticism of contemporary super imperialisms, etc. Let's begin with say that the dreams of the Western imperialisms after World War II and the end of history, enigmatic thesis, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, promised a more general happiness. A tolerant multicultural cosmopolitanism has supposedly led into a transcontinental alliance of imperial ethno-nationalisms. Is this not reflecting the peak of xenophobic, racist, white supremacy of Euro-Atlantic modernity and recent intensification of NATO and AUKUS directing process of identity and otherness toward Russia, East and South China, South as archaic, ignorant, etc., that need to implant Western democratic civility and free market neoliberal capitalisms. And fascism for us, fascism is and authoritarianism is not an extension of capitalism outside of it, but it is rather an inherent essence of capitalist imperialism, its mode of operation and expansion across the world. This also say that the growing imperialist eroticism has fooled their inflammatory patience to construct otherness and inevitable needs to dominate. And behind all of this madness lies the erotic energy of capital that required to settle and rule everywhere, narcissistic requirements of the ruling oligopolies of the center. The more expansionist, aggressive, and global repression toward sovereignty is rooted in the overexpanding conflict and contradiction within the inter-imperial order itself. The long economic depression, followed with historical frustrations of the imperialist states that are now fomented the permanent aggression and, of course, growing risk to third global war. Thus, the ongoing US-led global imperialism war on Russia and China was founded by long-sustained relations of dominations and subordinations between the imperialist state itself. In here, US, West Europe, and Japan. So I refer to this case as a false unity of imperialisms. Since the middle of the 20th century, US has not only waged a war, pillaging, plundering, intervening, and dominating the third world of Asia and Africa, Latin America, but also, and more importantly, an economic war against Europe. For the current crisis in Ukraine, US has turned the allies to engage in a war that will pay with the preservation of their submissions to US command and pay the price for US strategy of empire building. The recent US-led NATO war against Russia aimed at China as well. The strategy of isolating China is not just simply by destabilizing and removing Russia from China and making a counter-hegemonic alliance, but it also serving to block the European from making stable trade, mutual trade with China and Russia. This will open the conditions that will prevent the greater Eurasian prosperity and multipolarity without US leadership. And that's including the prevention of further China promoting Belt and Road Initiative. In order to destabilize Russia, to topple the existing regime in Kremlin, is to continue recycle it back into a client peripheral capitalist state, serving the US strategic goals, ways that will further isolate, weaken, and again turn China into a backward periphery status, complement US and Western monopoly needs for capital accumulation and empire building. In short, the anti-hegemony coalitions of China, Russia, and the third world socialist democratic regimes aims at creating an alternative non-neoliberal war without NATO and US Central Command. It is important to note Russia is not an imperialist state that engages in inter-imperialist war or partitioned world territorial divisions. To label countries as imperialist simply with exporting capital is flawed, very non-dialectical, and since most of the countries, even poor third world countries, are also exporting capital now, even Angola exporting capital to Portugal and so on. In this, I would like to call for all the peace-loving anti-hegemony countries, to all the socialist state, and all the people of the global south and working class struggle in order to recover the popular and democratic sovereignty by the linking from the imperialist neoliberal economic order, and more importantly, to de-dollarize the economy. That's because the international monetary system based on dollar or as war reserve, its will to provide the credit and taxing across the world, it's to impose austerity, sanctions, or more general economic line of Washington consensus is the foundation of US economic imperialisms coupled with military form of imperialisms. To de-dollarize is critical to international class struggle among capital and labor, people of the South with North monopolies. Since the US cannot run out of money, it can print all the money, it can recycle all the dollars that it can It has pumped into the world economy. Once they can recycle back into the US Treasury bonds as monetary saving, etc. And that's, for instance, like foreign countries buying US Treasury security with US dollar, etc., will end up financing US spending abroad, will ensure its balance of payment deficit, or in short, we can say that we are subsidizing the US global militarizations by investing millions of dollars to military expenditure and military base in all the continents. This historical change is central to US imperialism since 1972. And it started to end since US decided to seize the Russian asset now. And we expect many more countries will decide to stop depositing or disinvest to US anymore from now on, consequence of the crisis. That's all because US have moved from the war creditor state to debtor state that make all nations pay for its government policy abroad. That's because we live in a dollarized neoliberal imperialisms. So by maintaining the dollar-based international monetary order, we are doomed to participate in US global war. We are participating in financing US continuing militarization of the war. It's war invasion of fascistic and right-wing counter-revolutionary regime across the world. We are financing the military base and operations that keep us in check and subjugations. For now, the US oil, agriculture, financial, industrial monopoly have benefited more from the sanctions. The recent drop of the production supply or energy export by Russia will affect the accumulation of war scale, but it will underdevelop many third world countries, a condition that will enable the imperialist economic diplomacy to impose neoliberal austerity, structural adjustment, dips, and so on. But now it also leads to blowback consequence, boomerang to the West. More countries are resisting Western sanctions. However, the US also, for decades since the 20th century, the US has lost all the wars that it has initiated in the beginning of the 20th century. Some have claimed that the era for military occupation is over. The mode of control now is financial. That is why alternatives to build a war without US dollar presented by China and Russia is intolerable for the US imperialisms and so on. Comrades and compañeros, we cannot have peace without socialism. We cannot have peace and socialism under financial imperialism. To achieve both under the tyranny of imperialism is totally absurd. In addition, you also cannot have development and democracy without socialism. Democracy of the West aims to internalize the regime of private property and end this accumulation for the 1%. It is a democracy that is empowering the minority financial tyranny, in which few predatory oligarchies select the candidates for the masses to exercise their 5 minutes democratic power to elect the representative of industrial, oil, and finance oligarchies for the executive power. That is totally a false option, and that's the sense of contemporary in triad imperialist countries such as US, Japan, and Western Europe. US, the guardian of world peace, as people have said, democracy, has almost a century inventing and arming the right-wing fascist Nazi and Islamic jihadists to fight against the secular people and proletarian state of East and South. From using so hard a fascist war to crush the PKI in Indonesia in 1986, threatening in East Timor in 1975, from financing extremist jihadists against Soviet Union in 1980, and to recent ISIS against Syrian regime, etc., in Middle East. This has been continued in Ukraine against Russia by utilizing the right-wing neoliberal regime and militia Nazism in Ukraine to play the US NATO chessboard and oppressing the people. Since World War II, US military intelligence operation has been directed to restore former Nazi elements and sustain the permanent Nazifications of the reactionary masses since the first decade of the 20th century for its fight for destabilization against Russia. This reflects the total mechanisms of war machines aimed at crushing a progressive mass popular movement and regime in the world by using the most reactionary, conservative, and fascistic element in the society. So the war in Ukraine forced us to choose between anti-imperialist and anti-fascist camp, or to side with imperialist fascist alliance co-opted with liberal leftist humanisms and pseudo-critic of the most Puritan Western leftists. I would like to quote my comrade Humberto Rodriguez in here, in our email chat, that soon everything will become more explicit and each one will adopt a side. Maybe to conclude, during the years, the economic line approach of US imperialism in Latin America and Asia struck economic aggressions and dominations, while predominant form in Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia is by militarisms, either by military invasion, occupation, intervention, proxy war, covert intelligence operations, etc., etc. But to engage both in Russia and China, US approach characterized the mobilization of its total instrument and integral aspect of economic military imperialism in its art of war. It is a proxy war that serving the strategic economic interests of empire building. That is by continuing the stabilization and encroachment of anti-empire states in the East and South, such as Russia and China, of reinforcing the accumulation of capital at war scale, while sustaining austerity, privatization of common resources, and an underdevelopment across the global South, and internal colonization in the center. Of promoting the international capitalist property, of protecting international capitalist property, business interests, preserving the US monetary imperialist order, and a constitution of its global hegemonic power. In short, preserving US unipolar war and illegitimate rule-based order, marked with a generalized exploitation and permanent oppression of the people of the world, and not to count the spoliation of the planetary ecology. It is also vice versa with the economic sanctions of continuing war of economy against Russia and its rival to China's yuan, and to subjugate the euro in order to preserve the geopolitical advantage, militarization of the war, and global apartheid under US military supremacy, so that the Pentagon will draw the war map after its own image, as Karl Marx has pointed out in the Communist Manifesto. To end, I would like to quote Michael Hudson in here, as he said, without such understanding of 1932 and 1933 and 1972 and 1973, where the latter US using IMF, World Bank, international economic, military, multinational diplomacy to create a dollar standard and turn allies to pay for US war, became a foundation of your imperialism modus operandi. Without such understanding, no post-dollar war can be created. Since 1932, 1972, and now in 2002, shows a continuing march of US empire building based on dollar hegemony, and Western imperialists have globalized its war of oppression, plunder, the third world more penetrative. We are living in a very dangerous time. We have entered the most reaction times. A new Cold War politics of war against all is reflected in imperialist trade war of economy, ideology, military against China and Russia. A war between force of barbarity against socialisms, between the most predatory, vampire-like of neoliberal financial capitalism versus industrial market socialism led by China. The Ukraine crisis is not about Russia's war against Ukraine. It's a war of two systems, a war, economic war that will not come to end in next year or years to come. It is a war that will shape a new global economic systems. A war economic system are facing tectonic shift now, and the transition has just started. Hence, in 1975, Nicolau Lobato, a leader of nationalist revolutionary movement of Fretilin in Timor-Leste, said, "A great leap forward to our liberation is irreversible." Hence, there is a fundamental shift in the world economic systems. The horizon of world socialism is much closer to us now than decades ahead, than ever. My dear comrades and compañeros, see you either in hell or communism. I think that's all. Thank you. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Thanks, camarada Fernando. Ahora irá hablar el camarada German por la tendencia bolchevique, militante bolchevique de Argentina.
¿Se me escucha? ¿Se me está escuchando, compañeros? Ante todo, una presentación de quiénes somos. Somos de la tendencia militante bolchevique de Argentina, sección argentina del Comité de Enlace por la Corte Internacional. Hemos estado en el Partido Obrero y el Partido Bolchevique por la Corte Internacional de Argentina. Nosotros vamos en el principio de los Estados Unidos y Corea del Norte y de todos los países oprimidos por el imperialismo, sobre todo los que hoy son considerados malditos por el imperialismo, como Venezuela, Irán y Nigeria. La tendencia militante bolchevique como tal se formó en el 2011 sobre la base de la oposición al imperialismo, como en Libia y Siria, y a los golpes imperialistas como en Honduras, Paraguay Guatemala, Ucrania, Brasil y Bolivia. Hoy, la ofensiva de los bloques imperialistas, constituidos por bloques anglosajón, europeos y japonés, en contra del bloque de países oprimidos en torno a China y Rusia, obliga a que estos últimos impulsen un frente único antiimperialista, más allá del carácter burgués del gobierno de estos países. Solo los comunistas internacionalistas pueden convertir esa resistencia defensiva en defensivo revolucionario. Hoy precisamos defender al bloque eurasiático contra la OTAN y la UCUS, y defender a la revolución proletaria y socialista dentro de ese bloque. En el ala derecha del Frente Único Antiimperialista Mundial que se está formando están los propios gobiernos de Rusia y China en su carácter burgués. En el ala izquierda de este fuga están las repúblicas populares de Doma. Hoy, en la guerra contra el nazismo y el imperialismo, estamos ante la oportunidad histórica de un nuevo reagrupamiento de la vanguardia internacional. En el pasado, la etapa de transición del capital concurrencial al monopolista en el periodo que incluye la guerra austro-prusiana y la guerra franco-prusiana dieron el contexto en que se formó la primera internacional y con la Comuna de París el primer gobierno obrero de la historia. La Primera Guerra Mundial se creó el contexto a partir del cual sin vergüenza se hizo posible y a partir de ahí la primera revolución socialista victoriosa y la formación de la Tercera Internacional, la Internacional Comunista. Las tendencias que llevaban a la Segunda Guerra Mundial dieron origen a la Cuarta Internacional. A su vez, la victoria sobre el nazismo que conmemoramos hoy, la victoria sobre el imperialismo en los procesos de descolonización en la posguerra, en que los frentes únicos, en los casos de los frentes únicos antiimperialistas no degeneraron en frentes populares de esos países, dio origen a un cinturón de estados obreros, como China, Yugoslavia, Cuba, Vietnam, todo el este europeo, que agrupados reunían a una tercera parte de la población mundial. En ese contexto, el estalinismo había liquidado incluso formalmente a la Tercera Internacional y la Cuarta Internacional también liquidada entre oportunismo y sectarismo. Bueno, hoy las tendencias que buscan a la Tercera Guerra Mundial, como se ven en el caso de Ucrania, generan condiciones y contradicciones que favorecen un reagrupamiento internacional por parte de las corrientes que no claudican al imperialismo, así como en Zimmerwaldland no claudicaban al social chauvinismo. Hoy, ante la guerra de delegación del imperialismo a través del gobierno nazi de Kiev contra Ucrania, se generan condiciones para un reagrupamiento internacional. En ese sentido, no claudicar hoy a la ofensiva imperialista es comparable a no claudicar a la degeneración socialdemócrata que devino al social chauvinismo ante la Primera Guerra Mundial. En la lucha contra el imperialismo estamos por la defensa incondicional de todos los países atacados por la guerra económica, militar, política o diplomática del sistema del capital financiero internacional. Pensamos, estos son los principios rectores a nivel internacional, los cuales se constituirá el futuro reagrupamiento internacional, del cual este encuentro es un antecedente histórico. Hoy conmemoramos el Día de la Victoria contra el Nazismo. Así como hoy nos pronunciamos contra el régimen neonazi de Kiev en su guerra de delegación del imperialismo contra Rusia, la clase industrial y la franja de lengua rusa, al igual que las minorías nacionales en la Ucrania. Somos conscientes que no alcanza con la resistencia a las direcciones burguesas del bloque eurasiático, para que éstas puedan poner para vencer al imperialismo y al nazifascismo. Esa resistencia a las direcciones burguesas del bloque eurasiático no es suficiente para derrotar al imperialismo y al nazifascismo por el propio contenido burgués que tienen las direcciones del bloque eurasiático mismo. Es en ese contexto que avanzamos a un reagrupamiento internacional que une el defensismo de los estados obreros con la lucha contra el nazifascismo y la lucha contra el imperialismo, teniendo como norte la revolución permanente contra el capitalismo. Bueno, por ahora eso es todo, compañeros. Espero que haya sido de utilidad.
Thank you, comrade. We have two speakers left. So thank you for waiting so patiently to the speakers at this end of the speaking list. The next speaker is Mike Gimbel from the United States. Mike, you're still on mute. Do you want to just unmute yourself? Okay, beautiful.
Okay.
Do you want to start again? Thanks, Mike.
Okay. I thank the organizers of this forum for inviting me to speak at this critical moment in world history. The entire world's future is being determined in the Ukraine. All communists around the world must rally behind the struggle against US, NATO-sponsored fascism. But a little history is needed to understand the war in the Ukraine. There is a bourgeois myth promoted by much of the communist movement that the US and the UK imperialism were not only allies of the Soviet Union in World War II, but in fact were the good imperialists versus the bad imperialists of Germany, Japan, and Italy. That these good imperialists only became bad imperialists after World War II. Did the US imperialism only become bad imperialists when they dropped the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and initiated the Cold War? Of course not. In creating the structure of Nazi Germany and their theory, Hitler used the model of US imperialism's massacre of the tens of millions of native peoples of this continent and used the US segregation laws as the model for the fascist Nuremberg laws. Yet millions of would-be communists continue to be fed the nonsense of the good imperialists in World War II, and this nonsense is being promoted by our fellow communist organizations. This is the greatest ideological service possible of aid to the corporate propaganda of the imperialists, and is shamefully done by people who call themselves our comrades. It is necessary for our communist movement to understand why World War II happened and how US imperialism was the world's greatest imperialist power before World War II, and how it used its world hegemonic economic power to strangle the UK and France and all of Europe and Japan, which in turn crashed the capitalist world market and drove the world into that bloody world war. The 100 million dead in World War II can be laid directly at the doorstep of US imperialism. The oppressed cannot understand today without understanding how we got here. The Cold War after World War II was a worldwide class war, which did not end with the tragic overthrow of the Soviet Union. Every worker and every oppressed nation suffered a huge defeat when the Soviet Union was overthrown. The capitalist rulers, led by US imperialism, saw the overthrow of the Soviet Union as a way to take back all the concessions won by the workers and the oppressed while the Soviet Union had existed. This worldwide class war, which was called the Cold War, intensified dramatically after the USSR was overthrown, as US-led imperialism went on a bloody rampage, destroying small nations one after the other. But US imperialism came up to a brick wall when trying to overthrow China, Russia, and Iran. The US-led imperialism had utilized economic sanctions as its preferred weapon against all the oppressed nations, but the sanctions has not worked in regards to breaking the resistance of China, Russia, and Iran. The opposite has happened. China, Russia, and Iran have been driven closer together for their own self-protection. And this alliance of resistance is inspiring the oppressed all around the world. The unity of China, Russia, and Iran is causing panic in the capitalist ruling circles. US-led imperialist control of the world capitalist market ever since the end of World War II has depended on worldwide acceptance of the US dollar as equivalent to gold. China's industrial base, however, is already far larger than the US industrial base. And China's Bridge and Road Initiative is beginning to dislodge the grip of US imperialist power all over the world. China, together with Russia and Iran, has become the primary threat to the dominance of US-led imperialism. If US imperialism cannot break the China-Russia-Iran alliance, it will face a run on the dollar, because that dollar is only backed by faith and threats, and above all, the US military, not by gold. US-led imperialism sees the writing on the wall. Its very existence is threatened. That is why US-led imperialism created the crisis in the Ukraine. The war in the Ukraine has suddenly turned the Cold War into a hot war because Russia said, enough is enough. You backed us into a corner and we will fight you and defeat you. There can be no misunderstanding. The fates of the oppressed nations under the thumb of US imperialism is closely tied to the result of the war in the Ukraine. A victory for US imperialism would be a disaster for the oppressed all over the world, while a victory for the Donbass and Russia will open up wide the possibility for every oppressed nation to free itself and for workers around the world to rise up against capitalist attempts to impose economic austerity. Unfortunately, as in the past, many comrades and communist organizations have helped US-led imperialism to confuse the masses with decades of nonsense attacking China and Russia as imperialists. We see the result today of these supposedly communist ideological attacks on China and Russia, which only helps the corporate media spread lies about the war in the Ukraine, and gullible leftists, having been propagandized against Russia and China by our own comrades, quickly accept the corporate media lies. This shameful ideological support for US-led imperialism must be fought. The result of the Ukraine war is that a line has been drawn between real communists who support the Russian anti-NATO and anti-fascist intervention in the Ukraine, and has been drawn between those on the left who are continuing to serve the propaganda needs of US-led imperialism by opposing the Russian intervention. Our movement today faces the same internal contradiction as occurred during the outbreak of World War I with the collapse of the Second International. Our movement has clearly diverted into separate roads, a Marxist road and a bourgeois road. My question to all the viewers: the overthrow of the Soviet Union was the greatest defeat of our class in human history. Can we create the basis for a new Zimmerwald type conference that can become the basis of a revival of the world communist movement? Is that not our duty as communists to try to create a new communist international. I think it is possible to begin the process of doing this, don't you? Where there is a will, there is a way onwards to a new communist international.
Excellent. Thank you. Back to you, Mike. Thank you. All right. I think we've got time for our last speaker. Berto, do you want to introduce our last speaker, please?
Camarada Neymar, do Partido Comunista do Povo Brasileiro, por favor, pode falar agora.
Obrigado, saudações a todos. Eu sou o Neymar, do Partido Comunista do Povo Brasileiro. Nosso órgão central é tribunaproletaria.org. E todas as quintas-feiras a gente tem uma live às 19 horas, onde a gente debate os principais temas aí. Nós partimos do princípio, existe a possibilidade de paz no capitalismo, ainda mais nessa época imperialista. Marx e Engels, no Manifesto Comunista, descrevem como a burguesia vence as crises. De um lado, destruição forçada da massa das forças produtivas. Do outro, através da conquista de novos mercados, da exploração intensa dos antigos. De que modo, portanto? Mediante a preparação de crises mais gerais, mais violentas, da diminuição dos meios para evitá-las. Portanto, a única forma da humanidade obter a paz frente ao imperialismo é derrubando o império. A prática do imperialismo norte-americano, pós-Segunda Guerra, tem sido de invadir, pilhar, saquear os países alvos dos seus exércitos. Começaram com a Coreia, Vietnã, Cuba. Há mais de 60 anos vive um bloqueio econômico, político e criminoso. No Iraque, alegaram a existência de armas químicas e destruíram aquele país. Responderam ao ataque do WTC com a invasão do Afeganistão, onde ficaram por cerca de 20 anos, e onde recentemente foram corridos. Deixaram para trás igual cenário, morte, destruição, invadiram a Síria, que reage, que resiste bravamente, destruíram a Líbia, que não conseguiu se reerguer até hoje. Não falamos de Granada, Nicarágua, Salvador, Panamá, Venezuela, até as Malvinas, que eles ajudaram os ingleses. No Haiti, em Guantánamo, tem uma área militarmente ocupada pelos Estados Unidos, construindo um campo de concentração, onde os prisioneiros são submetidos a toda sorte de barbárie, crueldades, torturas, empalamentos, assassinatos. Com seus aliados da OTAN, assassinaram publicamente seus opositores pelo mundo. E aqui na América, derrubaram os governos como Manuel Zelaya em Honduras, Fernando Lugo no Paraguai, Evo Morales na Bolívia e a Dilma Rousseff no Brasil. Agora, a tentativa do Império é destruir, cercar e destruir a Rússia. E o governo de extrema-direita da Ucrânia, Zelensky, apoiado pelos grupos nazistas, está a serviço do Império Norte-Americano. A gente acha que o mundo vive uma crise, pior ainda, depois dessa guerra aí, que obrigou a Rússia a ter uma ação militar defensiva na Ucrânia, porque ela, cercada pela OTAN, se obrigou a tomar essa medida militar. O que vai resultar dessa crise? Mais crise, e mais violenta, que vai atingir a Europa como um todo e o resto do mundo, né, de uma forma que a gente avalia muito grave. O que a gente está pensando que vai ocorrer com o Brasil? Na verdade, a gente acha que esses países imperialistas vão usar os seus exércitos agora aqui na América Latina, posteriormente a essa crise na Ucrânia. Por quê? Porque o mundo vai carecer de matérias-primas, né? E eles tranquilamente vão invadir. A gente acha que a única forma de defender a soberania do Brasil e da América Latina como um todo é unir o povo na rua. E a unidade dos revolucionários, sobretudo. Porque hoje a gente vê uma esquerda com medo de ser esquerda, uma esquerda que não quer ser protagonista, não só aqui no Brasil, mas no mundo todo, uma esquerda que se esconde, que não mobiliza. A gente vê, por exemplo, na França, a extrema-direita na briga com a direita. Aqui no Brasil não é diferente. A extrema-direita briga com a direita, enquanto a esquerda fica na janela vendo a banda passar, esperando a banda passar. Então, a gente precisa do quê? Mobilização. Para isso, a gente entende que o mundo está vivendo uma nova fase dentro da esquerda, em que o oportunismo tem que ser combatido de forma muito mais firme, porque não adianta dizer-se contra o imperialismo, porque soa como uma frase oca, isso é o Lenin que dizia, se não tiver firmemente uma postura contra o oportunismo. Então, a gente precisa combater o oportunismo na esquerda e combater o imperialismo de uma forma geral. Para isso, a gente defende a frente dos revolucionários, ou frente única, como chamam os companheiros, para a gente poder ter uma influência direta na luta de classe. A gente acha essa realidade extremamente desfavorável, mas contraditoriamente ela possibilita que o movimento revolucionário se reorganize, né? Estude o que ocorreu de fato na União Soviética, né? Por que houve o debacle, por que aconteceu já toda a crise do socialismo na União Soviética, e que a gente possa dar um salto de qualidade. Essa é a nossa expectativa. A gente sabe que a humanidade vai passar dias muito cruéis daqui para frente, já que, pegando a realidade do Brasil, é uma realidade que está os trabalhadores estão chegando à proletarização muito mais fácil, né? Muito mais gritante o estado de miserabilidade do povo trabalhador brasileiro. Essa realidade não tende a melhorar, embora a gente tenha uma eleição em que possa barrar o governo de extrema-direita, mas mesmo assim a crise é uma crise violenta, vai precisar de muita organização do povo para poder não só resistir, mas combater o economicismo e dar um passo à frente nos direitos dos trabalhadores. A gente deixa a nossa contribuição aqui, agradece o espaço cedido pelos camaradas e estamos à disposição. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, camarada Neymar, pelo Partido Comunista do Povo Brasileiro. Agora, o camarada David Heller vai fazer o encerramento desse painel.
Okay, thank you very much. I will just, thank everyone for their presentations today. It was a true exemplar of what Marxism is meant to be, which is internationalism, workers working together from around the world. We had workers and we had socialists and Marxists speaking from all around the world today. That included in different languages, which of course is a practical difficulty, but part of rejecting the social chauvinism that our comrades from South Korea pointed out. Everything can't be in English. So we will ask all our comrades to send us transcripts to Liga Comunista or the Class Conscious emails, and they will be translated into English and Spanish and Portuguese and other accessible languages. Please, comrades, could do that. So thank you very much for today. I think, we have achieved our goals on May 9th. We have reflected on the victory over fascism achieved by the Soviets, largely by the Soviets on May the 9th, and the defeat of fascism. We've dedicated ourselves together, working together to defeat fascism today, to defeat imperialism today, and to fight together for socialism. So thank you, comrades, workers of the world, to unite onwards to a new international, to socialism, and to victory. Thank you.